The page was torn from a Forest Service field book, the kind with the green cover that they used to issue decades ago. The handwriting was my grandfather's. I knew it the way you know a voice you grew up hearing, the heavy downstroke on every capital letter, the cramped numbers that leaned right as if they were walking into a wind. The page held a data table, 2 columns, visit number on the left, pulse count, and pause duration on the right. Visit 1, continuous pulse, no grouping. Visits 3 through 5, 3 pulse groups with 6-second pauses. Visit 6, 4 pulse groups with 8-second pauses. Visit 7, 5 pulses, 12 seconds. The numbers matched mine, not approximately, not close enough to suggest coincidence. They matched exactly, entry for entry, through 9 visits to a canyon that I had been entering alone for the past 5 weeks under the belief that I was the first person to document what I was hearing. My grandfather recorded this sequence in 1978. I recorded the same sequence in 2024. The man who handed me the page was sitting on a rock in a drainage no one visits, wearing 30-year-old boots, and he knew my grandfather by name. I need to go back to September to explain how I ended up holding a dead man's field notes in a canyon that hums. My family has held the Javelina grazing permit on the Gila National Forest since 1974, when my grandfather Pete Maddox converted a handshake arrangement with the previous permittee into a formal 10-year term through the Wilderness Ranger District office in Silver City. The allotment covers just over 11,000 acres on the east side of the Mogollon Range, running from Pinyon Juniper Flats at 6,200 feet, up through open ponderosa parks and into mixed conifer near 8,500. It is cut by 4 major drainages running roughly east to west, feeding into the larger creek system that eventually hits the Gila River. The best grass grows on the benches between drainages, south-facing slopes where the ponderosa opens up and the understory carries enough blue grama and bull muley to sustain a cow-calf pair on about 40 acres through a full grazing season. The worst ground is in the canyon bottoms, where Gamble oak and New Mexico locust grow too thick for cattle to move efficiently, and the footing goes to cobble and sand when the water runs. Burnt Canyon is the northernmost of the 4 drainages. It earned its name from a fire sometime before my grandfather's era, though there has been enough regrowth that you wouldn't guess it now. Ponderosa and Douglas fir have recolonized the upper slopes, and the canyon floor carries a dense riparian strip of oak, alder, and box elder that smells like wet bark and leaf rot in the fall, a heavy sweetness that mixes with the mineral dust kicked up by your horse's hooves. The lower 2/3 of the canyon is ridable. The upper third narrows into a slot where the rhyolite walls come within 15 feet of each other, and in monsoon season that slot runs fast enough water to roll boulders the size of truck tires. Nobody goes up there. There is no salt block, no trick tank, no fence line, no maintained trail. According to my grandfather, there was a prospect hole somewhere in the upper reaches from the old Mogollon mining days when they were pulling silver and copper out of every drainage that showed quartz. But he never found it, and neither have I. I have been the primary writer on this allotment for 11 years. Before that, I wrote it with my father from the time I could sit a horse without help. The work is not complicated, but it does not stop. We run around 160 mother cows on the permit, rotating through 5 fenced pastures on a schedule determined by grass condition and water availability. Every week during the grazing season, April through November, someone rides the fence lines, checks the water developments, and counts cattle by pasture. When wire is down, you fix it. When cattle drift, you move them back. In country this size and this rough, that is a full-time job for one person and a half-time job for 2. And since my father's knees gave out 5 years ago, it has mostly been me. I ride a 12-year-old buckskin quarter horse named Reno, who has more sense about this landscape than most people I have worked with. I carry a fence kit, a first aid kit, a handheld VHF radio tuned to the ranch frequency for my wife, and a Garmin 6.6i GPS unit I have used for 4 years to log every mile of every ride on this allotment. I also carry a Baofeng UV5R that I use to monitor the Forest Service administrative frequency and the county search and rescue channel. I do not transmit on those frequencies. I listen. On this allotment, radio coverage is poor. The terrain blocks VHF line of sight from most of the canyon bottoms, and the nearest repeater sits on a peak 18 miles south that only covers the lower pastures reliably. In the upper drainages, you get nothing. No cell signal, no radio, no satellite lock if you are deep enough for the walls to cut your sky view. I mention this because it matters later, and because it is part of the texture of working here. You are alone with the country in a way that most people never experience, and on a good day, that is the best part of the job. October in the Mogollons is the finest month this country offers. The monsoons break in September, and the air dries out and goes thin and cool in the mornings, cold enough at 6,200 feet that you can see your breath at the trailer before sunup. By mid-morning, the sun has burned through, and the ponderosa bark smells like warm vanilla and turpentine, a smell I have known my entire life and still notice every fall when the humidity drops. The light goes yellow-gold across the south-facing benches, and the grama grass turns bronze, and the whole country looks like it was painted by someone who understood what beautiful means. I do this work because I was born into it, but I would have chosen it anyway. On an October morning, riding the upper fence line with the Mogollon Rim to the west and nothing between you and the sky, but 200 yards of open Ponderosa Park, there is no place on earth I would rather be. My father told me once that Burnt Canyon was bad for cattle. Not dangerous in the way a rimrock pasture is dangerous, where a spooked cow can go off a ledge. Bad in a practical, economic way. Cattle that drifted into the lower reaches would come out on their own within a day or two, thinner than they went in, as if the browse was not worth what it cost them to eat it. He never grazed it intentionally. His fence plan was designed to let cattle access the bench above the canyon, but not drop into the drainage itself, and in most years that worked. The few cows that found their way down came back out. He mentioned this the way you mention any piece of range knowledge. Some draws just do not hold cattle well. Bad water, poor footing, sparse feed. There are a dozen explanations and none of them require anything unusual. In the third week of September, I was missing 4 cows and 2 calves from the north pasture. This is not unusual in late monsoon season. Rain pushes water into drainages that run dry the rest of the year, and cattle will follow water into places they otherwise avoid. I spent 2 days checking the standard locations, the saddle crossings where cattle sometimes slip between pastures, the stock tank on the east bench, the old loading chute on the forest road where they bunch up near vehicle traffic. Nothing. On the third morning, I was pulling out of the forest gate when Tom Peralta, who runs the Rocking K allotment adjacent to ours on the south side, pulled up in his truck and rolled down his window. "You missing stock?" he said. I told him I was down 6 head from the north pasture. He pushed his hat back and squinted past me at the road. "I've been losing weight on my cows along that ridge. Last 3 years. Can't figure it. RangeCon says my utilization numbers are fine. My water is fine. Everything checks out on paper. Cows just don't gain like they should up there." He shook his head. "My dad used to say the same thing about that whole north end. Bad ground." I asked him if his cows had been drifting into any of the drainages. "Not mine. Mine stay on the benches. But I seen some unbranded stock down in one of those canyons last spring when I was riding the boundary, standing in the creek bottom doing nothing. Figured they were yours." They were not mine. All my cattle are branded. But I thanked him and drove through the gate and thought about what he had said. 3 years of poor gains on the ground adjacent to Burnt Canyon. His father calling the north end bad ground, the same words my father used. 2 families, 2 generations, same conclusion. I found my missing cattle on the third day by riding the rim of Burnt Canyon and glassing the drainage from above with binoculars. 2 of the cows were visible about a half mile into the canyon, standing in the creek bottom near a cluster of gamble oak. They were not grazing. They were standing parallel to each other, both facing upstream, motionless. The temperature at the rim was pleasant, maybe 65 degrees in the mid-morning sun, but I could feel a cooler air pooling in the drainage below, the way cold settles into a canyon bottom, the way water fills a ditch. The two calves were nowhere visible. I have watched cattle for most of my life. A cow that has found water and feed either grazes or lies down to chew cud. A cow that is sick stands hunched with her head low. A cow that is alert to a predator lifts her head and faces the threat, ears forward. These two were doing none of those things. They were standing the way a horse stands in a cross-tie, as if they had been parked. I watched them through the binoculars for 10 minutes. Neither one shifted weight. I could see them breathing, but that was the only movement. I picked up the VHF and called my wife at the house. I've got eyes on two of the missing cows. They're in Burnt Canyon, about a half-mile in from the mouth. You going down after them? Going to try. They're acting strange, just standing in the creek. Eli, your lunch is on the counter. You forgot it. I told her I would eat when I got back and signed off. Then I rode down into the drainage from a game trail on the south rim, picking my way through juniper and loose tuff. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of 50 yards as I descended into the canyon shadow. The air took on the cool, mineral smell of wet rhyolite and creek water, underlaid with the faint sulfur note that volcanic rock carries in this country. Reno did not want to go. He planted his feet twice on the switchbacks, and I had to push him, which I attributed to the footing, which was steep and rotten, with decomposed tuff that slid under his shoes. It took about 20 minutes to reach the creek bottom. By the time I got there, both cows had moved. They were 50 yards further upstream, still parallel, still facing into the drainage, but now walking slowly. I fell in behind them at a distance. This is where I first heard it. I thought it was the radio. The bao feng was clipped to the left side of my chest harness, squelched to the Forest Service frequency, and the sound came from that direction. But it was not a voice or a tone or static. It was a single sustained note, steady in pitch, low enough that I was not sure at first whether I was hearing it or feeling it in my molars, like a tuning fork pressed against the bone behind your ear. It lasted about 4 seconds, stopped for 2, then repeated. Same pitch, same duration, same interval. I pulled the bao feng off my chest and turned down the volume. The sound continued. I turned the radio off entirely. The sound continued. I reached for my earpiece before realizing I had left it in the truck. The sound was not coming from the radio. It was in the canyon. I sat on Reno and listened. The cycle was precise. 4 seconds on, 2 seconds off. The pitch was constant, somewhere around the low hum of a refrigerator compressor, but cleaner. No harmonics, no wobble, no drift. It was the most mechanically consistent sound I had ever heard in a natural environment, and I grew up sleeping 30 feet from a well pump. I turned a slow circle in the saddle, trying to localize the source. It seemed to originate upstream, but in a narrow canyon with rhyolite walls, sound bounces in ways that make directionality unreliable. I could feel Reno's ribcage tighten between my legs. His ears were locked forward, aimed at the upstream corridor, and his nostrils were flared in the way that means he is processing something he does not understand. The two cows kept walking, slow, steady, upstream, not hurrying, not grazing, walking into the canyon like they were being led on an invisible halter. I followed them for another quarter mile. The canyon narrowed. The oaks thinned and the walls gained height, going from shoulder-high clay banks to 20-foot rhyolite cliffs streaked with dark seep stains and patches of pale ite lichen. The creek was running about 2 inches deep over sorted gravel, and the sound of the water should have masked anything quieter than a shout. But the signal, and that is what I was already calling it in my head, carried through the water noise as if it occupied a different channel entirely. It did not compete with the creek. It coexisted. Two conversations in different languages in the same room. I stopped when the canyon made a hard bend to the northwest. Around that bend, the walls close into the slot section my father had warned me about. In monsoon season, you do not go around that bend on horseback, because if water comes, there is no way out. The sky was clear, but I could see the high water mark on the walls, 3 feet above current flow. Recent rain. I was not going to risk Reno in a slot canyon on a drying monsoon creek. The 2 cows walked around the bend and out of sight. I sat there for a full minute, listening to the signal pulse. 4 on, 2 off, 4 on, 2 off. The air in the slot was 15 degrees colder than the rim had been. A still, dense cold that sat against my face and carried no scent at all, which struck me as wrong. Canyon air should smell like water and stone and whatever's growing along the creek. This air smelled like nothing, as if something had scrubbed it. Then I turned Reno around and rode out. That evening, I downloaded my GPS track to my laptop, which is standard practice for me. I keep a digital record of every ride on the allotment, partly for my own reference, partly because the Forest Service range conservationist likes to see utilization patterns when she does the annual inspection. The track from that day showed my ride in, the descent from the rim, the half-mile follow-up the drainage, and the return. Normal. But the unit also showed a second track that I had not recorded. Same date, same start point, same distance, 6.14 miles. The second track ran into Burnt Canyon, continued past the bend where I had turned around, followed the drainage deep into the slot, and terminated at coordinates I wrote down. 33 degrees, 21 minutes, 8.4 seconds north. 108 degrees, 49 minutes, 31.1 seconds west. I checked those coordinates on a USGS topo quad. They correspond to the upper terminus of Burnt Canyon, just below the ridgeline, in a section so narrow and steep that the contour lines merge into a single brown band. Nothing is marked there. No trail, no structure, no survey monument, no spring symbol. There is no reason for a GPS track to terminate at that point, and I had not been there. The Garmin had been on my saddle, in its cradle, the entire ride. I had not touched the track recording function. The unit does not create phantom tracks. In 4 years of daily use across 11,000 acres of rough country, it has never recorded a track I did not ride. I went back for the cows the next morning, rode the rim, glassed the drainage. All 4 missing cows were on the bench a quarter-mile south of the canyon rim, grazing normally. Both calves were with them, nursing. Body condition looked fine, coats clean, no visible injury. Whatever had drawn them into the canyon had released them, and they had come back out on their own. I could not hear the signal from the rim. The canyon was quiet. A red-tailed hawk was circling on a thermal above the slot, and I could hear a canyon wren singing its descending scale somewhere on the south wall. Normal country, normal morning. The smell of sun-warmed juniper drifting up from the lower slope. I should have left it there. Missing cattle found. No loss, no injury. Ride the fence, check the water, file the count. That is the job. My father would have noted the incident in his tally book and moved on, because the cows came back and the grass was good, and the work does not stop for curiosity. But I kept thinking about that phantom GPS track, about those terminal coordinates, about the way the signal had pulsed with a mechanical regularity that belonged to nothing I could name. 3 days later, I rode back into Burnt Canyon without telling anyone where I was going. This was a mistake. Not because of what happened, but because I violated the most basic safety rule in this country. You tell someone your route and your expected return. I did not, because I did not want to explain why I was riding into a drainage with no infrastructure and no cattle to check. I reached the creek bottom by 9. The signal was there. Same pitch, same interval. 4 on, 2 off. It was louder than the first time, or I'd become more attuned to it. I left Reno tied to an oak at the mouth of the narrowing section and went on foot around the bend. The slot was dry, no standing water. The cobble was rounded and sorted by size in the way that high-velocity floodwater arranges material, largest on the margins, graded fines in the center. The walls rose to 40 feet on both sides, close enough that I could touch both simultaneously by stretching my arms. The signal was louder here, and I could now perceive a directionality. It was coming from above and ahead, from the upper canyon, from the direction of those coordinates. I walked for 20 minutes. The canyon made 2 more bends. The light changed from direct sun to ambient glow, the sky narrowing to a strip of blue between the walls, and the temperature dropped until I could feel it on the backs of my hands. No wind, no insects, no birds. The only sounds were my boots on cobble and the signal, which had grown loud enough that I could now hear something I had missed at a distance. A texture inside the note, a very faint modulation, as if the steady pitch contained a pattern within itself. Not random fluctuation, structured variation. Like someone speaking a single vowel but varying the pressure of their breath in a deliberate, repeating sequence. I stopped at a wide spot, maybe 20 feet across, where a pour-off ledge about 8 feet high blocked the drainage. Above the pour-off, I could see the canyon continuing upward at a steeper angle. The signal was loudest here. I put my hand flat against the rhyolite on the south wall. The rock was vibrating. Not dramatically. If I had not been looking for it, I might have missed it. But the stone was humming at the same frequency as the sound, the same 4-second pulse, the same 2-second rest. Warm rock, warmer than the air, as if the vibration were generating heat, or as if something beneath the surface was. I tried the Baofeng, scanning through frequencies. On the Forest Service channel, nothing. On the Ranch channel, nothing. On the Search and Rescue channel, nothing. But when I switched to the AM aircraft band, which the Baofeng can receive but not transmit on, I picked up the signal. Clean and strong, as if a nearby transmitter were broadcasting a steady carrier wave on 126.4 megahertz. That is not a standard aviation frequency. It sits between Albuquerque approach control and a Unicom band. Nobody should be transmitting there, and certainly not from inside a rhyolite canyon in the Gila backcountry. I recorded 12 seconds on my phone, played it back standing in the canyon. The recording captured nothing but wind and my own breathing. The signal that was loud enough to feel in the rock face did not exist on the recording. I climbed the pour-off using hand and footholds in the rock and looked at the drainage above. Flood debris, logs, boulders, a shredded section of old barbed wire from some long-gone fence piled against a choke point. Beyond the debris, the canyon bent again. I did not continue. What stopped me was the sudden awareness that I could no longer hear the signal. It had stopped while I was climbing, and I had not noticed the moment it ceased, which was more disturbing to me than the sound itself had been. I had been listening to a precise mechanical 4/2 cycle for 20 minutes and could not identify when it ended, as if it had been running underneath my attention rather than on top of it. I climbed back down. I walked to Reno. I rode out. Over the next 2 weeks, I made 4 more entries into Burnt Canyon, visits 3 through 6. I told my wife each time and gave her a return window. I brought a Zoom H1N digital audio recorder on visit 3. Same result as the phone. The signal was audible in the canyon, present on playback inside the canyon, and absent from the file when played anywhere else. On visit 4, I brought a handheld EMF meter, the kind they sell for home inspections. Background readings in the lower canyon ran 0.2 to 0.5 milligauss. At the pour-off, the meter climbed to 4.3 milligauss and pulsed in sync with the signal. Not a dangerous level. Roughly what you would read standing next to a running refrigerator. But there was no refrigerator. There was no wiring, no power source, no infrastructure of any kind. Rhyolite walls, flood cobble, and a 4.3 milligauss's electromagnetic field, pulsing 4 seconds on, 2 seconds off, out of the rock. On visit 5, I brought a better radio, a Yaesu FT60R with wider frequency coverage. The signal was present on every band I checked between 120 and 150 megahertz, strongest at 126.4, but also detectable on the Forest Service VHF channel, the ranch frequency, search and rescue, marine band, weather radio. Not as interference or noise. As a clean carrier wave sitting beneath the normal noise floor of each frequency, detectable only if you knew to listen for it. On visit 6, I noticed something that changed my understanding. The signal's interval had shifted. It was no longer continuous, 4 on, 2 off. It was grouped. 3 pulses with the 2-second gaps, then a longer pause of 6 seconds before the next group of 3. I timed it with my watch over 10 full cycles. The grouping was consistent. This was the first time the signal had changed since I had begun entering the canyon. I sat on a boulder at the pour-off with my field notebook, the same kind of spiral-bound book I use for fence tallies and cattle counts, and I wrote down the pattern. Visit 6. 3 pulse groups, 6-second pauses. The October sun was angling into the upper slot in a thin blade of light that hit the west wall and turned the rhyolite the color of dark honey. I sat there for 20 minutes timing the pulses, and I realized I was doing something I had not done since I was a boy following my father on these rides. I was paying attention to the country itself, not to what I needed the country to do for me, listening not to plan or to fix, but just to hear what was there. Then I climbed back on Reno and went home and made the table. Visit 7 the following week. 4 pulse groups, 8-second pauses. I felt the shift within minutes of reaching the pour-off, as if the drainage had been waiting to show me the next increment. Visit 8 2 days later. 5 pulse groups, 12-second pauses. I mapped the EMF readings at 20-foot intervals up the drainage and found a gradient that peaked at the pour-off and declined in both directions, upstream and down. The formation was broadcasting from a specific zone. Visit 9. 6 pulse groups, 14-second pauses. The relationship between pulse count and pause duration was nearly linear. I graphed it on the back of a livestock inventory form. Each visit advanced the grouping by 1 pulse and the pause by roughly 2 seconds. This was not random geological activity. This was a structured, evolving transmission, and the variable that changed between visits was my presence in the canyon. I decided the pattern was about me, that each entry into the drainage advanced the signal structure by 1 increment, that I was in a dialogue with whatever was producing it, and that if I continued, the pattern would keep evolving until I understood what it was communicating. I was wrong about that. Not about the pattern being real. The pattern was real. But I was wrong about being the variable. I learned this on October 30th, which was the first time I entered Burnt Canyon and found someone already there. Before I describe that encounter, I need to go back to October 3rd, because something happened between Visit 5 and Visit 6 that I have been circling around. The north pasture fence runs along the rim of Burnt Canyon for approximately 2 miles. I maintain it. I know every post, every splice, every spot where elk have pushed through, and I have had to restitch the wire. On October 3rd, I rode the line and found a section that was wrong. Not broken, not sagging, wrong. 4 strands of barbed wire 4-point standard 14-gauge stretched between 2 of my posts. My posts with my orange-top caps. But the wire between them was not mine. My wire is old. Most of the north line goes back to the 1990s. It is weathered to a dark rust brown that you can feel under your gloves, rough and pitted. This wire was bright. Not new exactly, but not 30 years old. And it was stretched to a tension I have never been able to achieve with a manual fence stretcher, tight enough that it sang when I flicked it with my finger. The section was about 40 feet long. 2 posts, 4 strands. I stood there on the ground, having gotten off Reno to check what I thought was going to be an elk break, and I ran my gloved hand along the top wire. It hummed. A low, steady hum that I recognized immediately. Same pitch as the signal in the canyon. Same clean, harmonic-free tone. I pulled my pliers from the fence kit and cut the top wire. It parted easily, standard wire, and the hum stopped on that strand, but continued on the other 3. I cut the second strand. Hum continued on 2. Cut the third. Continued on 1. I cut the fourth wire, and the canyon below went silent. I do not mean the hum stopped. I mean the canyon went silent. No wind sound from the drainage, no bird sound, nothing from below the rim. As if cutting that last wire had closed a circuit rather than opening one. The silence lasted about 15 seconds. Then the normal sounds returned. Wind through Ponderosa on the far rim. A Steller's jay calling somewhere south. The ticking of Reno's bit as he mouthed grass. I looked at the 4 cut wire ends hanging from my posts. They were now the same color as the rest of my fence line. Dark rust brown, weathered, pitted, old, as if they had always been there. I replaced the section with wire from my fence kit. My wire pulled to my normal tension. It took about an hour. My hands smelled like rust and leather by the time I finished, and the October sun was warm on the back of my neck, and the country looked completely normal. And I was standing on a piece of ground that had just done something I could not explain to anyone without sounding like I had lost my mind. That evening, I called my father. He was at the house in Silver City, 60 miles south, watching a baseball game with the volume too high. I had to repeat myself twice before he turned it down. I told him I had been in Burnt Canyon and heard something unusual. I described the signal, the pitch, the pulse interval. I described how the cows had behaved. I did not describe the GPS anomaly or the fence. I was not ready to sound that far gone. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear the crowd noise from the game in the background, thin and distant. "Your grandfather heard it," he said. I asked him what he meant. He heard something in that canyon. Late 70s, maybe 80. Said it sounded like a motor running underground. He went in a few times trying to find it. Figured it was connected to the old mining, a pump or a generator somebody left in a shaft. He never found anything. I asked if he had ever heard it himself. Another long silence. Once, 94, maybe 95, winter. I was riding the fence after a snow. I heard it from the rim. I did not go in. I asked him why not. "Because your grandfather told me not to." That was all he would say. He turned the baseball game back up and asked me how the Cavs were gaining, and we talked about the market for 10 minutes and hung up. The conversation had the shape of every conversation I have ever had with my father about this allotment. Practical on the surface. Something unspoken underneath, load-bearing and invisible, like the roots of a ponderosa that go down 3 times as deep as the tree is tall. I now knew 3 things I had not known that morning. The signal was at least 45 years old. It was sometimes audible from the rim, and there was a family precedent for hearing it and choosing not to investigate further. The last piece of knowledge should have stopped me. My grandfather avoided Burnt Canyon. My father avoided it. The instruction was clear, delivered the way my family handles everything, not through argument, but through example. When the people who came before you avoid something, you avoid it. But my grandfather never had a GPS that recorded phantom tracks to coordinates he did not visit. My father never cut fence wire and watched it age in front of him. Whatever they encountered was either a lesser version of what I was encountering, or I had already crossed a line they stayed behind. Either way, the protocol of avoidance felt like a tool too small for the problem. On October 30th, I walked into the narrowing section of Burnt Canyon on my 9th visit and found a man sitting on a rock 50 yards past where I usually tied Reno. He was older, Anglo, canvas coat, leather boots, a hat that looked like it had survived 3 decades of field work. No pack, no horse, no vehicle at the trailhead on the forest road. He was sitting still, looking upstream into the slot, and he turned his head when he heard my boots on the cobble. In 11 years of working this allotment, I have never encountered another person in Burnt Canyon. The drainage is not on any trail map. There is no destination in it. Hikers use the creek systems further south, where the hot springs are. Hunters work the ridges, not the canyon floors. This man had no reason to be here and no visible means of arrival. He looked at me the way you look at someone you have been expecting. "You the Maddox kid?" he said. I told him I was Eli Maddox. I am 34 years old and have not been a kid for some time. I did not appreciate being called one by a stranger sitting in a canyon on my family's allotment. "Your grandfather was Pete Maddox," he said. Not a question. I asked who he was and how he had gotten here. His name was Devery. He said he had walked in from the ridge, which was technically possible, but would have meant a descent through loose talus and cliff bands that I would not attempt without good reason and both hands free. "I'm a geologist," he said, "retired from the survey. I have been studying this drainage for a long time, longer than you have been alive." I asked if he was the one producing the signal. He laughed, short, dry, the kind of sound that acknowledges a question without finding it funny. "That signal was here before there were people in this canyon. I just figured out how to listen to it." He told me to sit down. I wanted answers more than I wanted to assert the authority of a grazing permittee telling a trespasser to leave. So I sat. What he told me over the next 40 minutes reorganized everything I thought I understood about the signal, the canyon, the allotment, and 3 generations of my family's relationship to this piece of ground. The signal, according to Devery, is piezoelectric in origin. The rhyolite formation in Upper Burnt Canyon sits on a fault zone, where slow tectonic compression generates measurable electrical charge in quartz-bearing rock. This phenomenon is documented in geology. Quartz under directional stress produces voltage. In most formations, the effect is transient and irregular, correlated with microseismic events. In Burnt Canyon, the specific mineralogy and geometry of the rhyolite, its quartz content, its fracture pattern, the angle of the fault beneath it, produce something different. A sustained, coherent electromagnetic oscillation, a standing wave in the rock. He called it a resonance cell, a geological structure that converts continuous tectonic stress into a patterned emission the way a tuning fork converts a strike into a tone. I asked about the grouping, the evolving pulse counts I'd been tracking. "That is the interesting part," he said. He leaned forward on the rock, and I noticed his hands were steady and precise in the way of a man who has spent his life handling instruments. "The resonance cell is responsive to pressure changes in the canyon environment, atmospheric pressure, water table level, and the weight distribution of objects on the surface. Large objects, a horse and rider, for instance. When something changes the load on the formation, the resonance pattern adjusts. Predictably." He looked at me. "You have been mapping the changes. I know you have, because Pete did the same thing." My grandfather. Mapping the changes. In the late 70s. That is when Devery reached into his coat and pulled out a Ziploc bag with a folded page inside. The field book page I described at the beginning of this account. He handed it to me, and I sat in the drainage with the signal pulsing its 6-group pattern around us and read my grandfather's handwriting and felt something shift in the geology of my own understanding. Not the land's geology, mine. The ground I had built my sense of this place on moved beneath me the way a fault moves, slowly and then all at once, and what had been level was no longer level. The numbers matched mine. Exactly. 3 pulse groups on visits 3 through 5. 4 pulse groups on visit 6, 5 on 7. The identical sequence, recorded 50 years apart in the same canyon by 2 men who shared a last name and a piece of ground and nothing else, because my grandfather died when I was 3, and I have no memory of him that is not a photograph. His table continued past where mine stopped. Visit 10, 7 pulses, 16-second pause. Visit 11, 9 pulses, 20-second pause. Visit 12, 13 pulses, 28-second pause. Then a note in the margin, in smaller handwriting. Signal continuous after visit 12. No further grouping. Duration 3 hours. Did not return. He stopped, Devry said. 3 visits short of saturation. That is why I am talking to you instead of him. I asked what happens after visit 12. The resonance cell reaches a saturated state. The signal becomes continuous and its amplitude increases. EMF readings go from single digits to levels that affect equipment, radio, GPS, compass, and the effect extends up out of the canyon to the surface above, your fence line, your bench pastures. The entire upper allotment sits on the margin of the formation. He paused. Your cattle gain poorly in the north pasture. They always have. Your father's cattle, your grandfather's before him. That is the field. At current levels, dormant, pulsing, it is a nuisance. At saturation, it becomes something else. I asked what it becomes. A sensor. The formation at full resonance is sensitive to atmospheric and seismic changes across a range that nothing portable can match. Pressure shifts, electrical precursors to weather systems, microseismic events. Your fence wire acts as an antenna. The signal modulates in response to environmental input. If you learn to read it, you know what the land is doing before any instrument can tell you. He let that sit. Your grandfather started the sequence in 1978 and stopped at visit 9. It took until roughly 2002 for the resonance to decay back to dormant. 24 years of elevated field strength on your allotment. 24 years. I calculated it against what I knew. My father working the north pasture from 1978 onward. His cows always thinner than the other herds. Every few years a cow walking into Burnt Canyon and not coming back. Written off as predation or terrain loss. All of it explained, retroactively, by a field that nobody knew was there. Why are you telling me this? I said. Because Pete did not know, and his cattle paid for it. Your father did not know, and he spent 30 years working compromised ground and blaming himself for poor weight gains. You are the first person in your family who has the information to make a choice. What choice? Stop entering the canyon. The formation needs 3 more visits to lock into saturation. If you do not provide them, the resonance decays over a year or 2 and returns to dormant. Your cattle stay out of the drainage. Your equipment functions. Your fence does not sing. I looked at him. The signal was pulsing 6-group 14-second pauses around us. I could feel it in the rock under my boots and in the wire fillings of my back teeth. And if I keep coming back? He reached into his coat and produced a second piece of paper, a printed satellite image in color showing the Burnt Canyon drainage from above. Over the image, someone had drawn contour lines in red ink. Not elevation contours, field strength contours showing the extent of the electromagnetic effect at full resonance. The outermost line covered everything north of the canyon rim for over a mile. My entire north pasture, the stock tank, the forest road where I parked my truck. If it locks in, he said, you will know when every storm is coming 3 hours before it arrives. You will know when seismicity increases because the signal will tell you. You will feel it in the wire, in the rock, in the ground under your horse. Your animals will avoid the dangerous ground on their own, and you will know which ground is dangerous. That canyon has been a sensor for millions of years. Your family has been living on top of it for 50. You can let it sleep, or you can learn to read it. He stood up. He left the page of my grandfather's notes with me. Then he walked upstream, around the bend, into the slot, and the sound of his boots on cobble faded until there was only the signal and the creak and the sound of my own breathing. I did not follow him. I sat in that drainage for an hour holding a piece of paper with my grandfather's handwriting on it, and I made the calculation. Let the formation sleep. Safe pastures, normal equipment, a career of riding fence and checking water the way my father did. On ground that behaves the way the maps say it should. The practical choice. The choice that protects the operation. Or let it wake. 24 years of saturated ground. Lighter cattle in the north pasture, measurable, real. A cost I can put a dollar figure on. Equipment anomalies. A canyon that broadcasts a signal only the rock can hold, but also a kind of knowledge no instrument can record and no agency can take from you. A direct line to what the land is doing, written in a language that takes 12 visits to activate and a lifetime to learn to read. I went home. I did not go back to the canyon for 2 weeks. The signal, when I rode the rim on a routine fence check, was inaudible. The wire did not hum. The cattle grazed normally. I could smell wood smoke from someone's stove down in the valley, and the aspens on the upper slopes had gone gold, and the country was quiet, and I let myself believe I could leave it alone. On November 15th, I found a cow dead on the north bench. A 4-year-old Hereford cross, one of my best producers, lying on her side 600 yards from the canyon rim. No visible injury, no bloat, no sign of predation. I called the vet, Jim Salazar, who drove out from Glenwood and spent an hour with the carcass. "I don't see a cause of death, Eli," he said, pulling off his gloves. "Heart failure is my best guess. It happens in younger cows more than people think." He looked at me. "You been having any issues with this pasture?" I told him the north pasture cows had been a little light this fall. How much light? Maybe 20 pounds per head under the south herd. He wrote something in his notebook. Could be mineral, could be water quality. You had the creek tested recently? I had not. I told him I would. He left. I stood next to the dead cow in the November sun, which was still warm at midday, but carried the thin, high quality of light that tells you winter is 3 weeks away. I checked the GPS collar I had started putting on my lead cows that season. Her track for the 12 hours before she died showed a straight line into Burnt Canyon. A stop near the pour-off, where the EMF readings peaked. Then a return to the bench that took 4 hours when it should have taken 30 minutes. She had stood in the drainage for 3.5 hours, motionless, in the signal field, before walking out and dying 600 yards from the rim. I do not know what killed her. I do not know that the signal killed her. I know that cattle are more conductive than people. I know that 3.5 hours of exposure to even a moderate electromagnetic field can do things to cardiac rhythm that a tissue sample will not show afterward. I went back into the canyon that afternoon. Visit 10. I went back the next day. Visit 11. On November 17th, I made visit 12. I walked to the pour-off and stood with my hand on the vibrating rock and listened to the signal shift from grouped pulses to continuous. A single unbroken tone that filled the slot canyon the way water fills a pipe. The EMF meter climbed to 11.6 milligauss and held. The Yasu howled across every frequency. My phone screen flickered and went dark. The air in the slot tasted like copper and ozone, a taste I have only encountered once before, standing near a power line that had been struck by lightning. I stayed for 20 minutes while the formation locked into its saturated state. The vibration in the rock under my palm was no longer subtle. It was continuous and deep, as if the entire canyon wall were a speaker cabinet, with the volume turned just below the threshold of pain. Then I walked out. The signal did not stop when I left the canyon. I heard it on the rim. I heard it at the truck. I heard it a quarter mile down the forest road, where it finally faded into the diesel engine noise. The wire on the north fence hummed a clear, sustained note when I checked it the following morning. The hum was different from before, more complex, modulated, changing in ways I could feel but not yet name. My GPS showed clean tracks from that point on. No phantoms, no anomalous recordings, as if the formation at full resonance was a cleaner broadcaster than the formation in transition. The first week was disorienting. I rode the north pasture fence, and the wire hummed differently at each post, and I had no framework for interpreting what I was hearing. The cattle moved off the allotment's north quadrant within 3 days, drifting south to the lower pastures without being pushed. They knew before I did that the ground had changed. The EMF readings at the rim, which I checked with the handheld meter, ran between 2.1 and 3.8 milligauss, depending on time of day, and I began to suspect on atmospheric conditions. On November 22nd, the wire's pitch shifted, not higher or lower, thicker. A harmonic entered the hum that had not been there before, and I stood at the fence with my hand on the wire and felt something I could not name. A pressure change, a restlessness in the metal, and I looked west and the sky was clear, and the forecast on my phone, which still worked intermittently at the rim, called for clear skies through the weekend. I moved the south pasture cattle into the sheltered draw near the loading chute. It took most of the afternoon, and my wife asked me on the radio why I was moving stock on a clear day, and I told her I had a feeling about the weather. The storm hit 18 hours later. Wind-driven sleet and a temperature drop of 32 degrees in 4 hours. It killed 3 calves on a neighbor's ranch 12 miles east. Mine were in the draw, sheltered, eating the hay I had put out that morning. I cannot explain how the wire told me. I cannot teach it to anyone. It is not a code. It is not a language with grammar and syntax. It is more like learning to read water, which my grandfather taught me as a boy. You watch a creek long enough, and you start to see where the current is fast, and where it is slow, and where there are rocks beneath the surface, even though you cannot see them. The wire is the same. You stand with your hand on it, and you let the hum enter you through your palm and your teeth and the bones of your skull, and eventually you begin to feel what the formation is feeling, which is everything. Pressure, temperature gradient, seismic micro-tremor, the weight of weather systems 300 miles away, pressing down on the atmosphere above the Mogollons. The range conservationist from the Wilderness District came for the annual allotment inspection in early December. Her name is Becky Trujillo, and she has been reviewing our permit for 6 years. We rode the fence together the way we do every year, checking utilization, looking at range condition. She stopped at the north fence and cocked her head. "Your wire's humming," she said. I told her it was the wind. She put her hand on the top strand and held it there for a few seconds. "That is not wind, Eli. That is a sustained vibration." She looked at me. "You got a power line running near here I don't know about?" I told her there was no power line within 4 miles. She wrote something in her inspection notebook and moved on. When we were riding back along the bench, she asked about the north pasture weights. I told her the north herd was running about 23 pounds per head below the other pastures. "Mineral deficiency?" "Could be. I'm looking into it." She nodded. She did not ask about the canyon. She did not mention the hum again. In her inspection report, which I received a copy of in January, the north fence section is noted as infrastructure conditions satisfactory, minor vibration noted in wire, likely environmental. She was more right than she knew. My father came up in March to help with calving. He stood at the north fence for a long time the first morning, not touching the wire, just standing in the cold pre-dawn air with his breath making clouds and his hands in his pockets. Then he reached out and put his palm flat on the top strand and closed his eyes. After about 30 seconds, he said, "Pete heard it like this, near the end, before he stopped going in." I asked him what he meant by near the end. He took his hand off the wire and looked at me. The expression on his face was one I had never seen there before. Not anger, not fear, something closer to recognition. As if he were seeing me clearly for the first time, and what he saw confirmed something he had spent his whole life hoping would not be true. "Your heart," he said. "Has the doctor talked to you about your heart?" My grandfather died in 1991 of a cardiac arrhythmia. He was 68 years old. The doctor called it congenital. My father has the same condition. A slight irregularity, a murmur that shows on an EKG but does not, in the cardiologist's judgment, require intervention. I have it too. It was noted when I was 19 during a physical for a summer job. The doctor said it was nothing to worry about. He said it was familial. 3 generations of Maddox men with the same cardiac rhythm abnormality, all of whom have spent their working lives on an allotment that, for 24 years at a stretch, pulses with an electromagnetic field at frequencies documented to affect cardiac rhythm in mammals. The herd of coincidence thins when you count the animals one by one. I do not know if the formation killed my grandfather. I do not know if it is slowly reshaping my father's heart or mine. I know that the knowledge it gives me has already saved cattle and will save more. And I know the cost of that knowledge is measured in pounds per head in the north pasture and possibly in years off a heartbeat that was compromised before I was born, or was made to look compromised by the country itself. In December, after the first snow dusted the upper rim, I hiked into the slot and climbed to the alcove I had glassed from above. I used a rope and harness borrowed from a friend who does rock work. The ledge was real, 8 feet deep, maybe 15 wide, with a shallow cave at the back. Inside, the walls were covered in linear striations I had first noticed at the pour-off, except here they were clearly deliberate, cut into the rock, parallel lines at precise intervals, covering every surface from floor to ceiling. Old. How old I cannot say. There was no pottery, no charcoal, no artifacts I recognized. Just the grooves in the stone, and the signal, which at that elevation was not a sound at all. It was a pressure, a weight behind the eyes, constant and enormous, like standing at the base of a dam and feeling the water above you. I stayed 10 minutes. I could not have stayed longer. Last Tuesday, I was checking the south fence line 3 miles from the canyon, and the Baofeng picked up a transmission on the ranch frequency. Not my wife. Not any voice I recognized. A clean, steady carrier tone. 4 seconds on, 2 seconds off. Single pulses. No grouping. I raised my binoculars and scanned the next drainage south. 4 cattle were standing in the creek bottom, parallel, facing upstream. Motionless. The brand on the nearest one belonged to the Rocking K, Tom Peralta's cattle. His allotment 3 ridges south of mine. His stock had no reason to be in that drainage. No water development, no feed, no trail. They were standing the way my cows had stood in September, parked and waiting. First visit pattern. 4 on, 2 off, no grouping. I thought about Tom at the gate in September, telling me about poor weight gains on his north end. His father calling it bad ground. The same words, the same ground. I put the Baofeng in my saddlebag, and I rode the fence south, and I did not look back. The signal in Burnt Canyon is mine to manage now. Whatever is starting in that second drainage is someone else's to find, or to leave alone, or to tune to wakefulness the way I did, one visit at a time, not understanding what they are building until it is built. I check the wire every morning. The hum is steady. The cattle know where not to graze. The weather comes when the wire says it will, and I move stock accordingly. And my losses this winter were the lowest they have been in 5 years, despite conditions that put my neighbors in crisis. I am a better rancher than I was a year ago, because I listened to a canyon that nobody told me to enter, and I made a choice that nobody would advise. The cost is 23 pounds per head on 160 cows across 7 months, which works out to roughly 3,600 pounds of beef at market weight, which at current prices is money I chose to lose. My heart beats the way it has always beaten, with the slight irregularity the cardiologist noted when I was 19, and I listen to it in the quiet of the bedroom at night while my wife sleeps, and I wonder whether the rhythm I am hearing is mine, or whether it was set for me by the rock, by the fault, by whatever hands cut those grooves in the ceiling of a cave that was not meant to be reached. The formation is awake because I woke it. My grandfather started the sequence and stopped 3 visits short, and for 50 years the canyon waited, pulsing its simple 4-2 pattern, patient as only stone can be patient, until someone came back to finish what he began. Whether the trade was worth it depends on how many years the wire hums and how many years my heart holds its rhythm, and which one of them stops first.